Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies, and I am the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this program in our Disability in the American Past series. The complete series includes 4 panel discussions, 3 seminars, a screening, and a K-12 educator workshop. You can learn more about this series at masshist.org/disability. I want to take a moment to introduce the Massachusetts Historical Society to anyone who might be joining us for the first time. We are the first historical society in America, dating back to 1791. We maintain a research library with close to 14 million pages of correspondence, diaries, and documents. Abolitionists, suffragettes, US presidents, mothers, daughters, inventors, preachers, and protesters. We make all of this material available to researchers for free, and also maintain an active schedule of programs and seminars throughout the year. As an independent nonprofit organization, we're able to do this thanks to the support of our members and donors. We hope you'll return for future programs or to explore our collections. Of course, if you enjoy our programs, we hope you will consider supporting our work by becoming a member. This evening, we are joined by 3 panelists who will discuss disability and the history of medicine. Going in order of which they'll appear. Our first speaker will be Professor Michael Rembis. He is a professor of history at the University of Buffalo. He has authored or edited many books, articles, and book chapters, including Defining Deviance, Sex, Science, and Delinquent Girls, 1890 to 1960, Disability Histories, co-edited with Susan Birch, the Oxford Handbook of Disability History, co-edited with Catherine Kudlick and Kim Nielsen, and Disabling Domesticity. In 2012, Professor Rembis co-edited and co-editor Kim Nielsen launched the Disability History book series with University of Illinois Press. His research interests include the history of institutionalization, Mad People's History, and the history of eugenics. He is currently working on a book entitled Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum. He will be joined by Professor Deirdre Cooper Owens. She is the Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and Director of Humanities and Medicine program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians. Professor Cooper Owens is also the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Currently, she is working on a second book project that examines mental illness during the era of the United States slavery, and is also writing a popular biography of Harriet Tubman that examines her through the lens of disability. Our final panelist is Professor Jaipreet Virdi. She teaches History of Medicine, Technology, and Disability at the University of Delaware. Professor Virdi's first book, Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History, raises important questions about deafness in American society and the endless quest for a cure. She is also working on an online resource database of historical artifacts used by and or crafted by Canadians with disabilities. A second project, From Prevention to Conservation, American Research on Hearing Impairment, 1910 to 1960, and is collaborating with Dr. Corinne McGuire to trace the historical roots of scientific research on disabilities in Britain and the role of women scientists. We'd like to point out that we worked with a great group of scholars and activists in planning this series over about 10 months. We appreciate all of their help and the support of our co-sponsoring organization. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreter and live captioner who are joining us from Partners Interpreting. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn this over to Professor Rembis.
Thank you, Gavin, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight, and to all the folks at the Massachusetts Historic Society for putting together the series of talks this month on disability and disability history. When I started to think about how I might talk about disability in the history of medicine, I thought that I would first offer a brief introduction about the relationship between the two fields, disability history and the history of medicine. and then talk a little bit about the new book project that I'm working on. In order to facilitate my talk, I've created a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so as I said, I'd like to talk about the relationship between disability and the history of medicine within the context of the new book project that I'm working on, which is currently entitled Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum, which looks at life writing of people who were institutionalized, committed to asylums in the United States between the 1830s and 1950. So as a way of introduction, I thought I would say a little bit about the two subfields, disability history and medical history. They take quite a different approach to thinking about disability and disabled or mad people. And I should point out here that I'm using disabled and mad people intentionally. And if folks want to talk about how we talk about the language that we use to talk about disabled and mad people, I'd be happy to discuss that in the question and answer portion of the webinar tonight. But as I mentioned, disability history and medical history have two very different origin stories. Disability history emerged out of the disability rights movement and out of disability studies, and has a focus and takes as its primary focus disabled and mad people. Medical history, on the other hand, emerged in the early 20th century at Johns Hopkins University, and at least initially was primarily interested in telling the stories of physicians, and was initially written by, those stories were initially written by physicians. The focus tended to be on how I refer to it as the 3 Ds: doctors, diagnoses, and drugs. In the 1980s, medical historians became increasingly interested in what they were calling the patient perspective. And I want to talk a little bit about that, about what it is, and how the disability history approach to the history of medicine is quite different than what medical historians have been doing since the 1980s. So as I mentioned, in the 1980s, medical historians became more interested in what they were calling the patient perspective. And in that, they focused primarily on, as it shows here on the left portion of this slide, the doctor-patient relationship. And there's an arrow pointing down from the doctor to the patient, because the history was written often from the perspective of physicians, even though medical historians were arguing that they were incorporating the views and the perspectives of patients. They were still told through the lens of physicians and of institutional documents and other sources that mediated the patient's experiences and the patient's interactions with the doctor. And the focus was usually on what was called the therapeutic encounter, or the interaction between the doctor in the process of treatment. There were some medical historians more interested in how patients were resisting medical interventions and creating patient cultures, but that was less of an interest for medical historians. And so I've depicted it here with a smaller arrow pointing up from the patient to the doctor. There was some focus on that, but the emphasis was much more on the perspective of physicians and institutions and hospitals. In the early 2000s, disability historians and other folks doing what became increasingly known as mad people's history became interested in thinking about disabled and mad people as people outside of the patient role, and thinking about their interactions with various different people and structures and organizations, and even their experiences of their own embodied experiences with the things that they're experiencing in their mind and experientially with their bodies and things. And so the effort was made to place disabled or mad people at the center of the analysis and think about their interactions. And here on the right side of this slide, I'm using arrows pointing in two directions simultaneously, but to think about disabled or mad people and their interactions with family and friends and work and in their love lives and with society, and of course with physicians and doctors and other healthcare professionals and providers. And as I said, their own kind of embodied experiences as well. And so the effort was to incorporate all of these different aspects of people's lives and think about them more holistically in their actions with their environment and the people around them. Two examples, I will just quickly use two examples to kind of concretize or kind of explain further the differences between medical history and disability history. This can be seen in two publications. One in medical history, David Oshinsky's Polio: An American Story. The other is the example in disability history is Dan Wilson's Living with Polio. And you can see even from the subtitles of the books, there are different foci, the different focuses that they have. So Oshinsky's book, the subtitle is The Crusade That Mobilized the Nation Against the 20th Century's Most Feared Disease. So the book is framed as a crusade to defeat polio, and the focus of the analysis is around the race to create the vaccine and the doctors and laboratories that were involved in creating the vaccine. With Dan Wilson's book, Living with Polio, the subtitle is The Epidemic and Its Survivors. So Dan Wilson is situating polio survivors, people who contracted polio, went through hospitalization, rehabilitation, and went on to live their lives with polio, is the focus of Dan Wilson's book. So you can see here, I hope you can see that the kind of the different ways in which the studies are focused. I think there's Oshinsky's, there's a sort of an indication here of the value that folks place on medical history relative to disability history. Oshinsky's book won the Pulitzer Prize in history in 2006. And while Wilson's book was published with the University of Chicago Press, which is considered a prestigious press in history, in the discipline of history, it didn't win a Pulitzer Prize. So in my study, Writing Mad Lives in the Age of the Asylum, as I said, I'm looking at life writing very broadly defined between the 1830s and the 1940s to think about various aspects of the lives of people who were institutionalized, who were committed to asylums in various states throughout the country, and came out and wrote about their experiences. People like Clarissa Lathrop, who's pictured here on the left, and who was institutionalized in New York State in the early 1880s and went on to testify before the New York General Assembly and to advocate for change, legal changes, and created an advocacy organization and fought to make changes in the asylum system. In the course of my research, I've read thousands of pages of sources produced by people who had spent time in asylums between 1830 and 1950, including nearly 200 memorials, pamphlets, and books written by former asylum inmates. Memorials were personal pleas made to legislatures for change. Pamphlets could range anywhere from 15 or 16 pages to 50 or 60 pages, and they contained people's experiences. Some could contain things like affidavits and other evidence that people were using to build their cases for institutional change during the 19th century. And then, of course, books are much longer, and in the books, people talk about their early life experiences, their experiences with institutionalization, and then their efforts to try to change the asylum system. In addition to this, I read thousands of newspaper articles, magazine articles in professional journals, asylum annual reports, the reports of investigative committees, the archives of organizations and individuals, and other sources, such as advertisements and radio programs, to try to get at some of these questions here on this slide about kind of the lives of people who had been institutionalized. And I found some really interesting evidence, and I wanted to share a bit here. I don't know that I'll read all of these because I think I'm getting a little close to the end of the time that I have with you, but I found, for example, in 1852, Stillman Morgan, who was a former inmate of the Vermont Asylum in Brattleboro, Vermont, prepared a memorial which he presented to the Vermont General Assembly, along with the petitions of ex-inmate Samuel James and 18 other former asylum inmates. And together they petitioned the Vermont General Assembly to investigate the conditions at Brattleboro and just generally advocate for change in the asylum system. I also have uncovered stories like the one of Benjamin Snyder, who was a really interesting man who served in the Civil War, began preaching against slavery in the Civil War, continued to preach and travel around the country and advocate for change after the Civil War. And as he wrote, he became 40 times a prisoner and spent more than 2,000 days and nights in what he called the belly of hell, which was the asylum. And his story, among other things, provides a really powerful illustration, I think, of the ways in which one's work could become interpreted as signs of madness. I've already discussed Clarissa Lathrop. Through her writing and the writing of other former inmates, I've gained insights into their own thoughts and ideas and feelings about their public life and their work in advocating for change. For example, Lathrop wrote that she admitted that appearing before the committee, the investigative committee in New York, and the large number of auditors who were in the room, all the reporters and spectators who were in the room, was very difficult for her because she had never appeared in a strictly public position before, even though she was a teacher, before she went to the asylum. But she still appeared before the committee a number of times, more than one time, because she wanted to do everything she could to provide what she called an effective attack upon the asylum system and to help its inmates. I've also found really interesting editorials written to letters to editors to newspapers, like the one here that was written in the 1870s, again, about the Brattleboro Asylum in Vermont. And the author of the letter wrote in part, if the Brattleboro Asylum had been founded on justice and humanity, as Mrs. March intended when she bequeathed the $10,000 to create the asylum, it would not take so many lawyers every session of the legislature to keep it from toppling over. We have no money to hire lawyers to work for humanity. So of course we are deprived of a hearing. And this person, of course, was lamenting the lack of, or the inability, the perceived inability of people to have a formal hearing in legislative procedures and legal procedures around asylums. But in many ways, former inmates and their allies had a very significant hearing, to use the word of this letter writer, in the form of public conversation and public discourse around asylums and changing them. And they were actually very influential in affecting change in the asylum system in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. Asylums continued to grow and expand, but in terms of commitment laws and postal right laws around postal rights and other things, former inmates and their allies were effective in creating those laws and in amending them. So I want to just conclude by talking a little bit about the challenges of doing disability history. Clearly, with its emphasis on written language and access to various means of production, life writing, no matter how broadly we define it, has limitations. I think it's limited by gender, although in my study, it's pretty equally divided among women and men, the writing is. But gender could be, in some settings, a limiting factor. Class, race, access to education, the facility with which writers can manipulate language have all influenced the types of sources, the types of written sources that researchers have available to them. And also, you know, former inmates had to find the time and had to have the resources to write. Although many considered themselves poor, they invested significant amounts of time, as well as emotional, mental, and material resources in telling their stories and the stories of other inmates. And so I think the written sources need to be read through that lens as well. But I think, and as I've argued in the book, instead of dismissing or discounting the work of mad writers as being exceptional or unrepresentative of the experiences of people who were institutionalized, historians should mine those sources for everything that they reveal. I think there are other ways that we can get at the experiences of mad and disabled people beyond written documentation. And I think, and I'm hoping that my two colleagues who are going to follow me will discuss some of those ways. So I will stop sharing, if I can figure out how to do it, my screen and end my presentation there.
Rembis. We're now joined by Professor Cooper Owens.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time out to share space and time with me while I present a new topic. And so this one is going to be on new work I'm developing about Harriet Tubman. And although it's let's see here, I'm going to start slideshow. Although it is intellectual history, but it is one that is informed by the history of medicine, but also disability studies. And so I want us to engage in a new conversation around Harriet Tubman. And it's a burgeoning one. It's been happening in smaller spaces. So in a couple of special issues and some journals, largely dedicated to feminist scholarship. But I want us to think a bit more broadly, incorporating Black studies theoretical models and disability studies theoretical models, in addition to the history of medicine and intellectual history, and to really think about Harriet Tubman as an intellectual figure. So I gave a talk similar to this. You're getting the condensed version because we have 10 to 12 minutes, but I gave a talk similar to this about a week or so ago. And I want to share some of that because I've also been kind of tweaking and reconfiguring some things. So you can see here too, before I go to the next slide, you can see, oops, this is just a resting image. It was painted by a colleague of mine, Harry Seymour, retired professor and artist, but you can see the lone figure here. My cursor is kind of circling Tubman, right? And it's almost like she's floating over the landscape, and beneath her, you can see the kind of iconic symbol of the Underground Railroad that she is conducting, and she does so as this solitary figure. Most of these images of Tubman, you will see her almost always solitary, right? And there is the assumption that Harriet Tubman is able-bodied, that she doesn't have disabilities. And so very often it's just kind of mentioned, yeah, she has these visions, right, that are kind of spiritual or supernatural in focus, but we don't really assess what disability means in the life of someone who I am raising up as an intellectual figure, particularly throughout her enslavement, fugitivity, and then her status as a free person later in her life. So there are a couple of things that I want to offer so that we're on the same page. First, and you'll see in the next two slides, I offer up these definitions of fugitive logic, but also spiritual cartography. And you might think, so what in the world do these things have to do with Tubman? I am offering up that Harriet Tubman gives us, as those interested in her life and her practices, she gives us the theoretical offerings of fugitive logic and spiritual cartography, and they are informed, in fact, by her disability. For some of you, you may know that Tubman suffered a brain injury when we think she was a preteen. She was, ironic enough, she was in the store. I took a picture of the Bucks County store. Once again, my cursor is here kind of circling the image. When I went to visit the historical site about 4 years ago. But she was in a store. There was a young enslaved boy who was actually a fugitive, and an overseer went to, in fact, asked Tubman to intervene so that he could catch the fugitive. She said no. And when the overseer went to throw a weight at the boy, and here's an image of the 2-pound weight, which is what hit Tubman, or at least a weight that size, or at the time she was Araminta Ross, she nearly dies. And from the age of about 12 or 13 until she dies in her 90s, she suffers from these sleeping spells, hypersomnia, so lapses into sleep her entire life, right? So she is disabled longer than she was quote unquote able-bodied. Also, this is something that I want us to think about when we talk about Tubman. Tubman is generally known in the public eye as someone who becomes well-known in her late 20s when she attempts to run away. But I want us to think back, right? Tubman gets married at 21 to John Tubman. She first escapes at 27. So as an enslaved woman who is married, Tubman never has a child. And in fact, after the dissolution of her first marriage and she marries again, she's in her 40s, so she is older, but she might still be able to bear children, and yet she doesn't. And she and her husband adopt a child. And so although we'll never know, Tubman doesn't speak about her reproductive health. She was illiterate for all of her life, so there are no written records that she leaves us. But if one is enslaved, right? I'm also a historian of slavery. If one is enslaved and you are in the words of Jennifer Morgan, a laboring woman, the idea that you could be infertile devalues you. So here's a person who never has children, and on top of that, suffers seizures and sleeping spells, right? And so her owner is literally said after she recovers from the accident when she was a preteen, he literally says he tries to sell her, no one wants to buy her for even a 6 pence. right? So her value is also, or I should say her devalued status is wrapped up in her disability. Further, during one of her trips back to Maryland to rescue family members and friends from neighboring plantations and slave farms, she has a toothache, and Tubman knocks her tooth out with the butt of her gun, right? Because she doesn't want the infection to take hold, right? And so what is interesting as well, here's a woman who also creates, right, a dental injury. And so it is something that I really want us to wrestle with as we think about Tubman going forward and the kinds of scholarship that's produced about her life, and also how disability studies has to be central to the ways that we think about Tubman as a disabled figure. So what becomes really important for me, right, is having us on the same page in terms of these theoretical offerings by Harriet Tubman. And so the first one I coined is called spiritual cartography, right? And it's the mental drawing of liberatory maps based on a Protestant God-centric human relational sense of being to one's environment. Spiritual cartography also functioned in Harriet Tubman's life as both a theory and a practices related to justice and freedom. I think a perfect example of this is in an 1863 article about Tubman that was featured in the Boston Commonwealth. And the reporter says, these are her words. She declares that before her escape from slavery, she used to dream of flying over fields and towns and rivers and mountains, looking down upon them like a bird, and reaching at last a great fence or sometimes a river over which she would try to fly. But it appeared like I wouldn't have the strength, and just as I was sinking down, there would be ladies all dressed in white over there, and they would put out their arms and pull me across. Now, I'm going to stop, right? Because I want to put on the professorial cap here and analyze this. Scholars, feminist scholars, Moya Bailey and Izetta Autumn Mobley wrote about this, right? Not the specific quote, but more generally, they're thinking about the ways that Black women have never really been written about holistically as disabled people. And what they write about, and I think this is central to the ways that other scholarship has portrayed Harriet Tubman, is they praise her resilience. They praise her strength, right? As if her disability, her resilience, or strength can't coexist. And so I'll quote here, resilience is praised while trauma, violence, and pain are too common to actually be interrogated for very long. The logic of Black hypervisibility produces subjects that are barred from weakness, and disability in Western thought, as figured through non-normative bodies, is an ultimate sign of unsuitability. But what does Harriet Tubman do in her own words, at least according to this reporter? She does what 21st century scholars and late 20th century scholars have been unable to do for the most part. She literally describes herself as being weak and fragile, right? But it appeared like I wouldn't have the strength. And then she has this kind of gynocentric way of Black women being dressed in white, right? Literally taking their arms and pulling her across. And so this happens in one of these dizzy spells, as she calls it, or sleeping fits, right? She is able to draw on a deep level of consciousness in this state caused by an accident that creates, in today's language, we would say this kind of neurological disorder or epilepsy, some people have surmised, but she's able to draw on this theoretical offering of Black women forming community that creates a safe space to pull, but also a recovery space to pull her out when she doesn't have the strength to do it herself. And I think that that's really important here. And it also draws on what I call this fugitive logic that she also provides for us, right? And she's able to draw on this even while, kind of having these fits where she is out for a few moments, but she's able to see the world, right? Because this offers her, these conditions offers her a sense of kind of isolation, right? And she's in solitude when she's in the earth. And or I should say the lived environment, right, where she's in the woods and those kinds of things. But it offers a form of thinking that's rooted in observation, in methodology or practice, and mobility of the environment, but also she's paying attention to those who control and manipulate the environment. So whether those are humans or members of the animal kingdom. And so in this way that she now has new ways of thinking and seeing about the world, right? She's able to strengthen her skills as a botanist. She's able to understand the cosmos, right? And there's a Black National Park Service staffer who called her an astronomer. And it's not this kind of hagiographic nod to her, but the fact that she's able to understand constellations and follow, Polaris, which is the North Star, by understanding the location of the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. And she's doing this, right? Once again, offering up this fugitive logic as a theoretical offering, all while in the state of disability post the traumatic injury that happens. So in terms of Tubman's disability, right, when we think about the one that is most known, epilepsy, it marked enslaved people as being of questionable value. And Jennifer Barclay, Michael Rembis's very smart colleague at the University of Buffalo, writes about this in her book, The Mark of Slavery. And Jennifer Barclay has this wonderful way of thinking about how the mark of slavery and disability work hand in hand, right? And so epilepsy marks enslaved people as being of questionable value, as it apparently did for Tubman, whose owner attempted to sell her only to find out, right, as I stated before, no one would give a sixpence for her. Epilepsy and fits, as well as other forms of perceived insanity or madness that Michael just talked about, feeble-mindedness, and idiocy were all conditions associated with the mind, but each were also distinctly embodied. Enslaved people who lived with these conditions or who slaveholders perceived as afflicted with these impairments were unsound and viewed as poor laborers, since they presumably lacked the mental acuity to accurately complete tasks, right? And as an iconic figure of strength, Tubman's disabilities are either effaced or not examined critically in historical scholarship prior to the early 21st century. The realities of an enslaved woman who might have been infertile and epileptic needs more careful study. Scholars such as Janelle Hobson, Tariq Pickens, Moya Bailey, Jennifer Barclay have issued calls for us to investigate how disability functioned in the lives of Black women and in Tubman specifically. Tubman's disability troubles the notion in 19th century practice that the Black body, read an able body, was meant for slavery and not freedom. So what do we make of the disabled Black enslaved body? As an enslaved person, she was devalued. As a free person, she was at risk of being exploited and further injured. That happened again in her older age when she was essentially scammed, in a plot to steal her money, right? Without ever denying the role and function of disability in her life, Harriet Tubman presented the opportunity for those considered normal to make themselves malleable to her specific needs, right? If she needed more sleep from hypersomnia or a spell, then those who valued her presence made space for her to exist as a disabled person. And we often don't think about this in slavery. Here's a woman who made about 12 trips between the late 1840s and 1860 to rescue about 70 people, 67 to 70 people. And all of these folk who are following her, they are literally having to make space for the conditions that she suffers from, right? Due to these fits, as she calls them, in these spells. And even in her older age, in the 1890s, Harriet Tubman decides that she wants to have brain surgery because the pain of her headaches, the pain of these seizures, right? They disabled her in a way where she didn't feel she was functioning naturally or normal. And so she goes into a hospital in Boston and she chooses to have brain surgery. In fact, in her words, she states that the surgeon sawed open my skull and raised it up and now it feels more comfortable, right? And she does this without anesthesia. And so for me, it's a question of what must this woman have to have endured to also prove her her strength, right? By choosing to, during that brain surgery, to just bite on a bullet, as other Civil War soldiers had done during her time, you know, in the during the Civil War as a Union soldier. And so there are, and a nurse. So there are all of these questions that I want to raise, hopefully answer, as this project grows and as I continue to do more research. But for me, it is about kind of reconfiguring the question that scholars raised in the 1970s around all the men being Black, all the women being white, but some of us are brave, right? It seems in Black studies and histories of slavery, right, all of the Black folk and the enslaved people are able-bodied. And so what does that mean when we think about iconic leaders like Harriet Tubman, who suffers from disabilities, Sojourner Truth, who suffered from a disability, Harriet Jacobs, who suffers from a disability. So to be able to think about either the oral histories that they offer or the texts that they offer us in different ways where we center their disabilities as opposed to praising their resilience as these kind of symbolic, you know, able-bodied people because they're somehow strong, I think has us losing sight of the richness of what disability studies can bring to the histories of slavery, to the histories of medicine. It's not something that I took as seriously as I needed to in my book, Medical Bondage. I was much more wrapped up, I think, with the concept of what infertility meant in terms of the economic devaluement of an enslaved woman. And yet I ran across all of these sources that listed people as disabled. So this was not something that was abnormal or unseen in enslaved communities. And so I'd love to be able to write this biography that places her as someone who suffered from a neurological condition, who possibly was infertile, and to have that really frame the ways that we can reconfigure and reinterpret Harriet Tubman as an intellectual figure. And also think differently about the ways that 19th century Americans responded to her. She was respected across the board. I mean, being recruited by some of the country's most elite white men to serve in the military, being feted by Black people across class and even status, right, as a leader of the community. And so I think it also offers another rereading of how we see 19th century people. So I will, and the ways that they respond to disabled figures. So I'm going to stop there. I welcome your comments and your questions. Thank you so much for sharing space with me. And these are just the citations for the images that I used.
Owens, and we now will turn to Professor Virdi.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us all today. And let me begin by way of an audio description in that I am a South Asian woman with short curly Black hair wearing this purple pink top. And I am in my home office, which means I'm surrounded with books and a bunch of houseplants. I want to thank my co-panelists for very nicely contextualizing the different ways in which we can think about the history of disability, MAD studies, and the history of slavery, as well as the history of medicine. As a scholar who works at the intersection of the histories of medicine, disability, and technology, I'm always thinking about how we can understand disabled bodies and how we can position the ways in which disabled people use technology as a way to conform or resist medicalization. So today I kind of want to outline how I think about what I refer to as technologies of the disabled body. I won't be sharing a PowerPoint presentation, so please just bear with me. And also I apologize if my voice starts to waver because I'm just recovering from an illness. So there are two ways I think about the historical disabled bodies within medicine. First, as an extreme, a kind of mismeasure that is useful for developing standard quantifiable norms. These are bodies whose subjecthood has been sometimes violently removed or restricted, almost always with the use of technologies like the caliper, the audiometer, or the spirometer. And these are all medical technologies. And these standard quantifiable norms are often used to classify and justify the mistreatment of disabled bodies, while at the same time creating a way of knowing through science and medicine that depends on understanding how these disabled bodies are different. These norms are then used more widely in science and society to tell us who counts as a citizen or who is worthy of access. And those who are not counted, they are often denied care or rejected or even institutionalized. So I'm thinking about bodies as something that can be used to quantify standards. I also think about the historical disabled body through the bonds that are forged between people and the objects that they rely on to navigate the society and the environment. For disabled people, these are often their prosthetics and their assistive technology, things that they often purchase or make or borrow to accommodate for worlds that are not designed for them. So often, they become bodies that are reshaped or strapped or enhanced by the technologies to create new ways of being. So some examples. In the 17th century, German paraplegic clockmaker Stefan Fallfaller built the very first self-propelled wheelchair. One of the first amputees of the American Civil War, James Hanger, designed a hinged artificial leg to replace the common wooden peg leg that was used by the Civil War soldiers. Robin Cavendish and Teddy Hall developed a motorized wheelchair with a built-in respirator. Shout out of talkies, for those silent films, the deaf silent actor Emerson Moya created captioning for deaf people to enjoy film. And finally, Betsy Farber designed new kitchen tools that were easier to use on arthritic hands. Often, all of these technologies, all of these innovations come from the need for adaptation to be able to fit into environments or spaces that are often not accommodating. In my first book, Hearing Happiness, I unpack these two approaches toward the disabled body, but more specifically, the deaf body, and what's referred to as the problem of deafness. And this problem is a medical issue, but it's also a social problem that is rooted into what the scholar Christopher Krenz defines as the hearing line, which is an invincible boundary that separates deaf and hearing people and creates a kind of conceptual binary that we can use to understand identity and negotiate the implications of that identity. So what does it mean to be deaf? What does it mean to be deaf in a hearing world? So this kind of identity becomes a narrative that toggles between deafness and hearingness, because deaf people, even though they're understood as being deaf, even though there are language and technology that are used to position themselves within a hearing society, they are still expected to pass as hearing. They're still expected to pass as being cured and make use of any medical and technological intervention that is available to them. So in my book, I talk about how this history is built on this broader cultural value about normalcy, including how people depend on medical intervention as a way to provide these cures. In other words, if medical technology can provide a cure that will transform non-normal bodies into normal ones, then we are obligated to accept that cure. And thus, since they are expected to pass with hearing and conform to social expectation of hearingness to assert their normality, deaf people historically and even now have relied on acoustic aids, experimental medicine, speech therapy, and a host of other unconventional therapies that promise grand miracles but often fail to deliver. So we still see examples of this today. We see this in the hearing for the first time video, which are very popular and very much loved by able-bodied people, because we see the triumph of scientific medicine and advanced technology. And of course, there is this really powerful emotional reaction on both the subject of the video, as well as us as viewers watching this video. A lot of these videos talk about the importance of cochlear implants as being leveled as a cure. When cochlear implants were first invented and approved by the FDA for widespread commercial use, first in adults only and then in children, the optimistic idea behind the ways in which this technology was promoted was not that it was a prosthetic, it wasn't an assistive aid, it was a technological cure that delivered a deaf person's sound. But it actually doesn't. Deaf people who have been fitted for cochlear implant often reveal that cochlear implants don't replicate the natural sense of sound, but rather they become one of many tools that are useful for navigating the surrounding and also being able to distinguish between different sound cues as well as aid speech. For many deaf people who are implanted with cochlear implants, this switch on factor, as I call it, is actually not easy. Therapy and training is required to adjust to the sound. And there's also these really expensive costs and complicated medical decisions that go into selecting the implant. And for some people, they actually cannot wear the implant all day. So if cochlear implants are a cure, then what happens when a deaf person turns off their implant or removes it? Does this mean that they are no longer cure? So in other words, where does the idea of cure, especially cure through technology, help us to understand the way in which we expect disabled bodies to be fixed? So we see this in other examples as well, including genetic cures for deafness that become sensationalized in the media, but they often blur more complicated issues regarding the technology themselves. And moreover, there is never any guarantee that even something as scientifically advanced as genetic engineering would actually eradicate hereditary deafness. But we still expect these kinds of cures. We still expect medicine and technology to eradicate any sense of difference. So while hearing happiness is about this historical quest for a cure and what it means for a deaf person to subscribe to and negotiate with this cure, my new work moves away from this history of assimilation and towards assertion. So what if instead of camouflaging deaf and disabled bodies, what histories can we write if we reposition our understanding of technology and look at these objects as objects of power to claim a disabled self? In other words, what if instead of the medical gaze, we examine the bodies through the disabled gaze? What creative and radical insight will we obtain? So what happens if we look at hearing aids and cochlear implants, for example, through the lens of the user? What new ideas about design and use, or even the mismatch between the organic body and the technology, what new insights can we discover? So I wanted to think about disability, medicine, and technology as this overlapping intersection that once we position from the viewpoint of the disabled gaze, we actually have opportunity to think about perhaps more colorful and radical histories about disability, about our expectation for cure. And I think above all, what it means to live in a society when we're constantly being pushed to accept normalization, and yet also encouraging of this kind of resistance to that forceful push of normalization. So I'm running out of steam today, so I'll just stop right now and join my co-panelist.
Thank you all very much for three really fabulous presentations. I think we'll probably only have time for a couple questions because we want to be conscious of time. But we did have a question early on from John, who said, what are some of the concrete changes that occurred in asylums because of activism? So I believe this would be probably for Professor Rembis, but all of you, of course, are welcome to respond.
Well, I'll just respond really quickly since we're low on time and I want other people to speak. But as I mentioned in my talk, there were the history of commitment laws, for example, is a very concrete change. And the postal rights of inmates, communications with the outside world were monitored, prohibited, and early activists of the 19th century were, instrumental in creating laws to protect inmates' rights to send and receive letters. So those are two really concrete examples. There are other things, especially when we get into the early 20th century. But I don't want to spend too much time because I know we're running really low.
Well, we had a question from an anonymous visitor who said, in my research, I have found a theme of white disabled people not only comparing their disabilities and how they're treated badly to being Black, but they also use Black community to get their point across while ignoring and not including Black folks with disabilities. My questions are, have you seen this as well? And do you think it is because they're ignorant to Black and brown issues, or is it something else?
I mean, so I can't necessarily answer that only because I'm not, I'm just entering into the disability history and studies, forum. So, I've read about it, I've seen it. Yes, it does happen. But do I have that kind of experience as a scholar to answer it? I don't, unfortunately.
Yeah, I also don't have a full answer to this, but I do want to emphasize that perhaps some of the problem stems from the fact that people tend to have difficulty thinking intersectionality. So they often prioritize one identity over another. And this is something that comes across a lot, I think, in my own work as well, in that for much of the 20th century, deaf people didn't consider themselves as being disabled. So they wouldn't align with other community activism or disability rights movement because they were worried that in so doing, they would lose the language rights that they had obtained. So it's a very complicated history as well. So I think your question speaks to that complex nature as well.
And I would just add that it is a complex issue within disability studies and within disability activism. And early disability studies scholars made these kind of as race comparisons that have since been really kind of vehemently critiqued by other disability studies scholars. I would recommend the person who asked the question read Anna Malo's article about when Black women start going on Prozac, and also there's Sue Schweig's article on when the Black Panthers and disability rights protesters collaborated with one another when they occupied the Hugh building in San Francisco in the 1970s. I think those two articles would be a really great place to start if the person wants to read about that question.
We probably just have time for one last question. So Eric asked, or he said, I want to thank the three presenters for their presentations. My question is for Dr. Cooper Owens, although I think that this could be for all of you, and is about language use. Was traumatic brain injury the terminology used in the 19th century? If not, what is the significant utility of identifying Tubman's having a traumatic brain injury? If so, how does the contemporary understanding of traumatic brain injury compare to that, to understanding of during Harriet Tubman's life? And I think, of course, this is a question for everyone. Medical technology changes. We understand things differently. But of course, we have to look at the past with the eyes that we have today. So, but Professor Cooper Owens, if you'd like to start with that.
Thank you for that question. It's one that I've been asked before, particularly when I was given a job talk. So I have an answer for that. I think, and I just have to be honest with you, when it comes to history of medicine, this is the thing, and it's not your question, but it makes me a little annoyed because we expect purity from people who write about the history of medicine. And yet, when I write about the history of slavery, no one has ever said to me, why do you say enslaved person, as opposed to the language used in the 19th century or 18th century? Black people were called the N-word. They were called slaves. Nowadays, people are saying the enslaver as opposed to slave master or owner. And so whether I say enslaved person or slave, does that actually take away from the context that I'm bringing? So if I were to use the 19th century language to describe Tubman, it would be sleeping fits. She was feeble-minded. She had, as she said, she had a buzzing feeling. But I'm writing for a 21st century audience, and I'm writing a book that contains contextual knowledge based on the sources that I use. And so if I say traumatic brain injury and epilepsy, although she might not have used that language to describe herself or even her doctors, we understand what that means whenever I describe the incident that happened to her. Just in the same ways, if I say a Black enslaved woman or boy or man was sexually, in fact, I say raped, guess what? Rape didn't exist for slaves in the 19th century. There was no legal precedent for an enslaved person to be considered a rape victim. So if I'm going to be pure and not deviate from 19th century language, it can't just be for the history of medicine when I say traumatic brain injury. It has to be for everything. And trust me, I can't get published if I call enslaved people the N-word. And so I don't say that to be flippant, and it's not your question, but I notice I have gotten that only in the history of medicine field. And what I'm hoping we can do is to have a more holistic conversation that actually addresses the ways that we're writing for a 21st century audience about the 19th century past, and that language does change. And often historians and scholars, we respond to that change because we want to be respectful of historical actors, so enslaved rather than slave, or we use language that people in the 21st century can understand with a footnote or with paragraphs or pages that describes the 19th century condition. So that's what I hope to do in my book. But thank you so much for that.
I just really quickly, I really like that response, but I think also as disability historians and historians, Mad People's historians, we have to push back against too some of the medicalized language, especially when it essentializes people and actually conditions. And so we can't assume that we know what traumatic brain injury means, right. And that we need to really do the work of contextualizing it and historicizing it.
Yes, yeah, context is always key, I agree.
Virdi, did you want to add? Well, I think we are now a few minutes past 6:30. So I want to thank all three of you and our ASL interpreter and live captioning person for a great evening's discussion. And if there's any unanswered questions in the Q&A, we'll be sure to pass them on to you. And I hope everyone joining us enjoyed the program. I do want to just thank our partners who helped us with this program. And then finally, just encourage anyone who would like to learn more to visit masshistory.org/disability for the entire series of programs that we have. We still actually have a good number of programs coming up, as well as seminars and a film screening. Hope you'll be able to join us for all of that stuff. Thanks. just want to thank our partners. So these are the different institutions who have been co-sponsors with us. And then finally, if you would like to learn more about this series, you can visit masshist.org/disability, and you should be able to find all the information there. So thank you all and have a great evening.